Hey everyone, today I wanted to go over a project that's been on my mind a little bit, and it's going to be a bit of fun, and I wanted to bring you along with me. And what that is going to be is to take two different franchises, one being Warhammer 40k, my bread and butter, the thing that I've been doing for years, and then mashing that up with a character from another franchise. And that was Mario. And for the franchise of Mario, what better character to use for the first trial of this than the character of the namesake, which is Mario himself. So let's make Mario from the cartoony franchise he's in and bring him into the Warhammer 40k world. So without any further ado, here we go. To start off, we are going to be sourcing the bulk of this model from the Lieutenant in Reiver Armor, which is from the Space Marine range. This is a really nice model because it's got a very dynamic pose that we can use as part of the build. And for this, we are going to be taking a couple other pieces from a few different kits here and there. And if I know what they're from, I will say as I go, but they were essentially pulled from my bits box. We will want to build out the kit as per the instructions, removing any of the mold lines as we go, but we are not going to be using any of the basing elements in the kit. Neither are we going to be using the head. We will be swapping that out later. We also want to stop just shy of attaching the arms when we build the model, which is because this model is armed with a knife and a gun, which is not primarily Mario-esque weapons and probably not Mario's primary choice of weapon. So we can deal with that in a moment. To fix this, we are essentially going to be doing some surgery. We're going to be giving the model a hand amputation on both arms. And the reason we're going to be doing this is so that we can swap the hands and the weapons out. And personally here, with a bit of hindsight, on the right hand, I kept the hand and just swapped out the weapon in the hand. And it probably would have been easier just to do a straight hand swap. However, I didn't do that, and you'll see that in the coming up steps. So bear that in mind if you wanted to essentially do a similar sort of project. It might be easier just to lop the hand off, put a hand holding a weapon that we want, and then we can carry on. From this point on, we are going to be starting to use pieces from other kits that aren't the Lieutenant. Mainly, we're going to be using Grey Knight parts and Dark Angel parts, but I can't remember the exact kits they come from. I know the Grey Knights are from various parts of the Combat Patrol, and I want to say that the Dark Angel parts are going to be coming from the Dark Angels Veterans kit, I believe, but I apologise if I'm wrong on that. Either way, we will be using various different parts, and I'm sure you can find alternatives and simulacrums for them in other sorts of kits. So let's jump in and I will stop waffling. This operation is going to start off on the knife hand. And first, what we're going to want to do is cut away the blade as well as the guard on the hand itself, doing our best to make sure that we maintain the look of the fingers. Also, we're going to be saving the protruding tang on the hand that is here. Once we've done all of the trimming, we will also need to rotate the wrist slightly. So to do this, we can take a craft knife, remove the hand at the joining part of the wrist using the craft knife, glue the arm in place on the model, and then we can follow it up by gluing the hand in place in its newly rotated position. We can then repeat this with the other arm. However, this time the arm is got a hand holding a gun at the end, and we don't want the gun, so we can lop that off at the wrist and pop the whole gun and hand assembly away for another project. Then what we want to do is take a hand that is holding a grenade. This one has come from, I believe, the Dark Angels kit, and we can glue this into place on the end of the wrist in place of the gun. The reason that we want to make sure that the arm itself is mounted and glued into the body before we go in and attach that wrist and hand section that we need to reattach is because we're going to be needing to make sure that the plane and rotation is correct. By gluing the wrist on first, we run the risk of not putting it in exactly the right position that we want it to be in, and then needing to go in and essentially redo the surgery. So it's easier to glue the arm onto the body, then glue the wrist in place, and we can check that rotation as it sits with the rest of the model. This then brings us to the actual weapon that that hand is going to be holding. And personally, I think of a hammer when I think of Mario. I don't know about you. Let me know in the comments if you think of a different weapon that I should have used. But conveniently, there is a nice model representation we can use for this, which is from the Grey Knights kits. They have a couple of spare thunder hammers, depending how you build the units. So I'm going to nab one of them out of my bits box, and we can use that thunder hammer to represent Mario's hammer going forward. Also, the grenade in his hand is a little bit too sci-fi, and I don't believe Mario carries a grenade, but don't worry, we will be touching up that later. Once we found a suitable section of Thunderhammer, we can snip it off of the sprue, then take a knife and go in and remove any of the overly noticeable Inquisition markings on the front of the hammer and potentially any of the sides. We can then attach a shaft. I've decided to go for a thinner shaft, more typical to the Mario look, as opposed to the thick shaft that comes on the Thunderhammer itself. Gluing that in place, and once that has dried, we can finally glue the whole weapon assembly from the handle to the hand of our Mario. Now that the weapon has been swapped out, we have a scabbard with no blade and no blade on the model to represent it. So we have a couple of options here. It could be that Mario had a knife and has since lost it. Alternatively, we could sculpt it so that on the base there is a knife, which will give us that representation of where the knife went. Or we can do as we're doing here, which is to go in and snip a blade handle from another kit and then gluing that into the scabbard. Then we need to move on to preparing some green stuff for our next couple of steps. Naturally, you could choose to use whatever medium that you prefer using for sculpting. So if you'd rather use Milliput or something like that, feel free, whatever you prefer sculpting with. I'm essentially using green stuff because it's what was to hand. When using green stuff, I found that by mixing it together and then leaving it 10-20 minutes, lets it firm up slightly while still being manipulable and sculptable. However, it is also less impressionable in the sense of it doesn't pick up as many fingerprints and it isn't as sticky, stretchy and tacky. So I tend to leave it around 20 minutes and then get to the actual sculpting. And what we're going to be targeting is making a cap for our Mario's head and for the grenade itself. And for the head, I found a really nice, bold, mustached head in the GW Resin Space Marine head accessory packs that they sell from what was Forge World and is now Games Workshop. So you can essentially nab something similar to that. Alternatively, if you don't have an available head like that, we can go in very carefully and sculpt a tiny mustache on a tiny face. But that is up to you. Your mileage may vary depending what you can get hold of. Once we have chosen our unhelmeted head, we can get to work with the green stuff. And I will admit I am not particularly great at sculpting, relatively rubbish to be honest. I tend to use putties and pastes more for gap filling as opposed to actually sculpting. But to approach this, essentially we rolled out a ball of green stuff putty to make the bulb of the hat, before pushing this onto the head down to around the level of a hat wearing position on the head, giving Mario a nice kind of beanie. Once the beanie was in place, we can then take a small strip of putty and push this onto the beanie to make a peak for the cap. That turns it nicely from a beanie into a cap, and then it's just a case of smoothing out any of the attachment joins and removing any tool marks, fingerprints or anything like that using a couple of silicone shapers. At this point, with the cap done, we just need to sort out the grenade. And what I'm trying to do here is essentially make it look like one of the mushroom bombs from the game or the universe of Mario. And to do this, I took a very small circle ball of green stuff, applied it to the top of the grenade on the model itself where it was holding it, and then tried to sculpt it into the bulb shape of the head of a mushroom. Once that was in place, I then used some tools to essentially pinch the corners down so it looked like the mushroom was growing up and out of the hand. And the reason I did this was actually relatively, hopefully in my mind, quite smart, which is on the front of the model, there is grenades in the straps. And I didn't really want to remove those grenades and have to either sculpt something else in or sculpt in straps to make it look like I haven't just hacked up a Space Marine model. And also, I didn't want to sculpt those grenades to look like something different. So by sculpting just one grenade to make it look like when you pull the pin it is grown into this mushroom, I feel that that head cannon is a lot easier to achieve than going in and sculpting everything on the actual model. So head cannon 1, actual sculpting 0, mainly because of my lack of skill. If you wanted to do tiny mushrooms on the chest bit as well, do that, it would probably look awesome. But that is essentially it done with the building. There's one tweak that we do later on that I'll discuss at the time. However, At this point, we're essentially there, but there is one thing that I think will help to tie the model into the Mario universe a little bit more. And it's one of the things that I love for all models, and that is a nice base. Essentially, we will be taking an appropriate size base that we want to use for the model, and then glue down a couple layers of cork to act as our flooring. By using 2 layers of a thin cork, we can shape it nicely to follow the slope of the base, giving us a nice inclined surface. Then we can work on the base's main feature. In this case, a big green pipe, which we will today make from a plastic storage pot, which happens to be about the right size. Except the rim here has threaded areas so that we could screw a cap on, and what we're going to use is some green stuff to fix this. Wrapping a relatively large amount of green stuff around the area and the threading, we can then line it up with the rim and start pushing it beyond the edge of that rim. This means that when we wet the very edges, we can push this down onto a hard surface, which will give us a nice expanded blown out end to the pipe. I picked these little pots up a long time ago and can't exactly remember where. It was either online or at a flea market, car boot sale, that sort of thing. But essentially they're just clear acrylic screw top pots. I've seen them most often for things like cosmetics, glitter, things like that. But they do have a couple of advantages of using these over using something like a PVC pipe. And the reason is, first off, the threads are slightly recessed, so we can apply our green stuff, make it flush with the non-recessed part of this pot, and then use that as extra grip when doing our previous steps of misshapening and expanding the end of the pipe. The other reason is because it's got an actual base. It's not a pipe, it is a pot, meaning that we've got that extra bit of mounting area and surface for things like super glue. Because what we're going to be doing, once the green stuff has dried on the pot that we've just done, we're going to be cutting a section out of our cork that is the same diameter. And because we've done this in 2 layers of cork, it makes it nice and simple just to remove the first layer. And then we've got a nice recessed section for this to sit on. If we want to go through 2 layers and make this slightly shorter, that's not a problem either. And what we want to do is cut that hole, remove the cork area, and then glue our new fresh Mario pipe into that section. That means that the base is essentially ready for painting. So once we're 100% sure that the epoxy or whatever we're using, the green stuff, the milliput, is dry on top, we can continue and get it sprayed. And for the actual paint job, we're using a zenithal base coat. As we know, in the old Mario games, the ground is broken into various elements. First off, we have the dirt, which is in the brown, dirty color. On top of that, there's normally a grass textured element. And then we have things like the pipe and any of the characters that will be acting on top of it. To simulate this, we can start off by applying a light brown paint around all of the heightened cork boundary edges we made earlier. And then the easiest thing here is normally to paint all of the cork areas in this brown, being careful not to hit the pipe. Once the brown has dried, we want to then go around and paint the entire top surface of the cork in a bright green, similar to that of the Mario games we know of old. As you can see from this reference image, in some of the older games, the textures do go up and down and have ridges that cover the dirt sometimes. So that is something you may want to replicate as well. And if so, just paint in green semicircles going round halfway down the brown sections of the base. It's then up to you if you wanted to texture color these in the additional steps we will do later, or just leave them in this green and brown overtone. We did that here initially, and then I decided that it would look a little bit cleaner just to have a plain brown base, so I went around and repainted it without the green markings. But if you wanted that flavor and that slightly more cartoon-esque style on the base as well, that is an opportunity that you might want to take. But with the top painted in a green, we can move on to the pipe itself, that big, glorious main feature of the base. To start off, we can base coat the pipe in a nice dark green. We want to be careful around the base of the pipe so that we don't get it on any of the grassy areas that we did earlier, but we do want to make sure that we get everywhere. Once we're in the 3 upper sections, we want to apply thick layers of this dark green base coat, always brushing horizontally. By using a large, thick amount of paint, we will manage to keep the depth of the brush strokes and we want to make sure that they are all in the same direction, which is why we're only brushing horizontally. Once this has fully dried, we should get some nice thick paint texture, and what we want to do is essentially repeat these steps again with an additional step. So what we want to do is put down a thick base coat color, the same as we did in the same color as last steps. But this time we're going to follow it up swiftly with a thick wet layer of a lighter green, putting down this lighter green in the main sections of highlighted areas where we would expect the light to hit from our viewing angle on the model. We can then brush this back and forth to get a transition from the darker green to this brighter green at the front, while adding in yet more texture lines from the thick paint that is being brushed horizontally. For doing this, we can use a relatively large brush, and what I'm actually using is a medium-sized flat brush. And the reason for this is when we get to the base parts of the model where it meets the actual dirt and things, we can go in with the vertical, very thin edge to make sure that we don't get paint where we don't want it. But then once we get onto the main body of the pipe where we're less worried about being really particular and careful because there's nothing there besides pipe that we're going to be painting, we can then shift it to its longer axis and then essentially clear through and put in those strokes nice and quickly. So that's one advantage. You don't necessarily need to use a small makeup brush, but having a flat brush as opposed to a round brush might be quite useful at this particular moment. Once we've done that, we do need to make sure that it is completely dry, however, because our next steps are going to involve essentially overbrushing and dry brushing. And if those thick ridges of paint that we've just managed to build in haven't cured properly, we're just going to essentially rip them up and ruin the paint job. So do make sure at this point that we are confident that those ridges and bulbs that we've put in that are essentially sackets of paint on the model, they need to be completely cured so that we don't have any difficulties. We are going to start off with an overbrush, and at this stage we don't have to go just horizontally. We can move back and forth in different directions, which will help to pick out the small amount of texture that we've painted on. We are going to be using the bright green that we used in our wet blend mix to start off with, and applying this back and forth, as I said, as a heavy overbrush. We want to target mainly the previously highlighted areas, trying to catch more of the center of our wet blended areas than any other parts of the pipe. This will help to bring out a little bit of brightness in those key areas. Then what we can do is go and grab a metallic, and we need this to be a metallic green. So either buy a metallic green paint like we are here. Alternatively, you can look at tinting a metallic with a ink if you have one available. This metallic is going to be lightly dry brushed across all of the pipe. We want to catch all areas and lightly pick out all of the textures. This will help to add a very light sheen to all of the pipes. Then it's a case of finishing off the other areas that are not the pipe. So the base sides can get a nice wash of a dark brown or a earth tone, something like that, before being dry brushed back up with the brighter brown. Then we can do the grass. And for something that is a retro Mario-esque design, let's go with some retro basing techniques and apply a little bit of static grass. First, we want to apply a layer of PVA glue, covering all of the green grass sections that we have painted so far. Once that is down, we can apply the static grass however we feel comfortable. Here we're going to be using this weird bottle applicator. It seems to work okay. You give it a shake, it's meant to static up the static grass, and then you lightly spray it from the nozzle, giving us static standing up grass. However you want to apply it, once the grass is down, let it dry fully, and then we can blow away any extra and give the base a nice rim job. At which point the base is done and it's only Mario who still needs painting. Tackling this painting of Mario is slightly different to when we paint normal projects. And the reason for that is we can't just follow box art or other examples given by Games Workshop in codexes or anything like that. Naturally, Games Workshop probably aren't going to rip off Mario's IP because, well, Nintendo are quite litigious is my understanding, and it's generally not what businesses do. However, we aren't in the same restrictions as them. We can do what we like as hobbyists. But the challenge we've got is Mario isn't a space marine and our space marine isn't wearing dungarees. So what we're going to have to do is essentially pick out the rough areas that we want. And the way I'm going to be doing this is making sure that the rough proportions and areas of color are correct. That way it will still look like Mario, so we have the right colors in roughly the right places. And that's kind of the guiding principle I'm going to be doing here. Naturally, he doesn't have a jumpsuit on, as I said, so we can't paint it exactly, but we can take advantage of a few different areas to give us that color contrast and the balancing amount of one particular color over the other. Starting off nice and simply with the boots. Mario has nice brown boots, so here we can take a dark brown and give those boots a nice base coat. Then what we can do is move across to the blues. Nice and simple, Mario has blue trousers, so we can easily go in and do a round of blue on all of the legs. But for the torso, we need to be slightly pickier here, and we only picked out the center raised chest plate. This allows us to come back in with our next steps using a dark red to base coat all of the other main chest area of the armor as well as the arms. We do need to remember, as this nearly caught me out, Mario has white gloves. So we can leave the zenithal here for now. We don't need to paint the hands white and we don't need to paint them red to then remember and paint them white. Then all we have to do is paint in all of the leathers and the straps. And these are simply going to be painted the same way as the feet to help make it cohesive. At this point, we've essentially got all of the areas base coated. And while I don't normally work in this way, I tend to paint all particular one color or one area to completion or near enough to completion so that I can build the rest up and judge it appropriately. I felt that I needed to base coat all of the areas to make sure the proportions were right, as I said earlier. By base coating everything and then looking, we can make the decisions of any tweaks now, rather than fully painting all of the blue, then painting the red and realizing actually this bit of blue should have been red. Then we've wasted so much time painting the blue. So by base coating everything and giving us that picture of where everything's going to be, we can then move on to the highlighting, which will be our next couple of steps. You will notice there are a couple of areas that are still undone, and essentially that's all of the metallics and the undersuit. We can give them a black base coat. The undersuit I'm going to keep black because that's a nice neutral color that we don't then have to worry about messing up any other areas of proportions or contrast. However, we're also base coating all of the metallic areas, and the reason for that is I like to paint metallics from a darker area. So by putting a coat of this Black Legion on all of the black and metallic areas, we know that they're ready for the future steps. But first, we are going to be doing our highlighting. For the highlighting of all of the areas here, we are going to be doing a little bit of mixing. Each area is only going to be getting two colors. We're going to be using the base coat color that we've used to this point, and then a brighter version of that color. This first round of highlights will be on all areas using a roughly 50-50 mix of each color's appropriate mix in order to make a nice midway between our two colors. And then what we can do is work round and in a very broad manner, catching nearly all of the areas except the most recessed or most downward facing areas, apply a rough highlight. Then what we can do is add more of our brighter color to the appropriate mix so that it's roughly 75% of our bright color and 25% of our base coat, which is deeper and darker. We can then use this to do another pass of highlights. This time we want to narrow and focus more on the edges and upward facing areas. Then once that's dry, we can finally apply our last round of highlights. This one using our pure bright color, either blue or red or brown, regardless of what we're using. We want it to be out of the pot, thinned down slightly and nice and bright. This will focus mainly on catching all of the edges in a typical edge highlight, but there may be some areas that we may also want to pick out, which are the most prominent upward facing areas that would be hitting a bit more light than the rest of them. The browns all got essentially the same treatment. As I said, they start from the brown base coat, the darker color, and then in a transitional mix of around 3 mixes, we get to the brightest brown color that is going to be our main highlight color. And we do that for obviously the boots, as well as all of the straps and scabbard and anything that could remotely be a brown tone that we may want to use as this leathery tone. With that done, there is one element that got similar but not the same treatment, and that was the purity seal, which from this point I'm going to be calling his overdue invoice. And the purity seal's papers were painted in the same way, built up over 3 steps, except instead of using a lighter brown like we did for the other brown elements, we went in and used a light skin tone or a bone colour to get a more papery, white parchment papery look. And then once that was dry, I just gave it a earth tone wash to darken it back down a little bit because it was a tiny bit bright after the final set of highlights. This means there's only a few elements or areas of the model left to paint. We've got all of the areas that are going to be metal, which we've already base coated in a black contrast paint so that we're starting from a nice dark place. Once we know that is dry, what we want to do is apply a base coat of a dark bronze. This will give us a nice dark place to work from and be our first level of metallics. Following this up quickly, we can do a round of highlights, and this round of highlights will be done using a brighter gold, before we finish up with a round of edge highlights using a mid to mild silver. This will give us a nice transition of metal tones from a darker rusty-esque brown bronzy tone up to the shiny light silver. This can then be finished off with a black wash once it's all dry in order to tie all of those stages together without much more work, leaving us with just the weapons. The grenades themselves get a paint of skin tone followed by a wash of flesh shade. This is designed to give them the look of that fleshy mushroom stem. While we do the same for the one in the hand, we do also want to paint the mushroom cap. And this can just be painted in a bright green before we apply some large white circles for that iconic Mario mushroom head look. Depending on the level of detail you've gone into when sculpting the mushroom grenade, you may want to use something like a dark green wash to bring out all of those details that we've sculpted in. If we're doing that, I would suggest doing it after we've done the first set of white dots. It will mean that we need to go in and redot the mushrooms, but we can essentially just dot the center of the circles we've already made, which will give us a nice transition from the green to a slightly greenish white to the bright white of the spot. Then it's just a case of that last thing, which is Mario's hammer, and we can get to painting that nice and simply. So for the hammer, we have the hammer and hands. So the hands are going to be nice and simple. We've already got them in that zenithal. What we want to do is apply an elf skin or a light skin all over the hands and give them a base coat in that, before then edge highlighting the hands, catching the knuckles and the fingertips of the hands with a nice bright pure white. Then what we can do is simply apply a white contrast. So I'm using an apothecary white contrast. And what this will do is add a nice little bit of contrast and a nice little bit of tonal difference to those areas, as opposed to if we just painted them white and then applied an apothecary white contrast or just a general contrast over them. Then what we have to do is finish the hammer. The head of the hammer is nice and simple. We can apply a dark contrast if we haven't already to start from a black base coat. Then what we want to do is take the light skin that we used for the hands and do a relatively heavy overbrush across the hammer, making sure to try and target from where the light would be hitting, so doing downward strokes across the model. Once we've done that, we can go around and do an edge highlight with white, again catching all of the top most upper facing areas, before going round with a generous coat of a black wash. Then once the wash is dry, we just need to glue our model to our lovely pipe base and we have a finished Mario Marine. And I really do like this. This is how it came out. Have a look. Let me know what you think. Personally, I really do like, as I said, how this came out. And there are a couple of things that we needed to make sure we learn and bear in mind while doing that. And this is, as I said, we didn't need to replicate the model exactly in the sense of Mario. We didn't need to build dungarees on the Marine or anything like that. What we needed to do is keep the key concept of Mario in mind and make sure the proportions and placements were roughly right, so that at a glance, when you look at this model, you think Mario. You don't necessarily think Space Marine, though that's what it is. There were a couple of bits on this final model that I haven't shown in this video, for the main fact of it was becoming very, very rambly in my opinion. So if you do want to see them, let me know and I can do little excerpts of the bits that you've not been able to see at this particular time. Those essentially were the face, as well as the backpack. We were just going to use the backpack for the Space Marine as normal, but just before I went in and painted it, I had a realization and I remembered that Mario doesn't normally have a backpack. However, Luigi does have a Hoover backpack that Mario has been seen wearing on occasion. So I did a quick hack job by making it look slightly like a Hoover backpack as opposed to a normal backpack. And that was done just by applying a little bit of wire to the back of the pack and then attaching a vent from a different backpack or a different power generator from another Space Marine kit to make that nozzly end of a Hoover. And that is essentially how we come up with this guy. If you are slightly annoyed that I didn't actually cover painting the face in this video, then what I'd suggest is checking out this video here where I go over painting 3 different faces in 3 different times, and you may pick up something there that you could use for this model. Otherwise, do remember to subscribe so that we can see you next time.